All right, thanks everyone for coming. It's good to see everyone back from spring break. This is, I think, one of our first event of the spring term. For those that I don't know, I'm Patrick Wheeler, and I'm the Executive Director for the Center for Digital Strategies. And we want to welcome you to what we know will be a really exciting and enjoyable conversation. Today's session is with David Sobie, who's a TO4. He is the co-founder of Happy Returns and now VP of PayPal after the acquisition in 2021. A long history in the retail and e-commerce space, as well as kind of thinking about supply chain and logistics, which, as you all know, has been an interesting space over the last few years in general. Happy Returns. How many people have used Happy Returns? Look at this. This is great. Even as far away as Hanover, and we've got a bunch of great Happy Returns. And this is sort of a reverse logistics company that allows you to return your e-commerce purchases in person. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. But this is also a special homecoming for us in the center because about 20 years ago, David was one of our fellows in the center. And so for us, it's extra special when we get to welcome back folks that were part of the center more acutely when they were here. And we're just really excited for a wonderful conversation. We're going to have some moderated Q&A, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions as well. All right. David, welcome back. All right. I want to start a little bit about right where you are now with Happy Returns. Like, I touched upon it in the intro. Can you tell me a little bit about what Happy Returns does as a business?
Yeah, so our mission as a company is pretty simple. It's to make returns beautiful. And we think about trying to make returns beautiful for shoppers, for retailers, and for the planet.
Yep.
More practically, our strategy is really to be the operating system for e-commerce returns. And when we think about the operating system, we think about software that powers the return portal on merchant websites, connected to a drop-off network, which many of you, it seems like, have experienced. We're the people that invented start your return online, get a QR code, and drop it off box-free in person for an immediate refund or exchange. So it's software as well as reverse logistics, the drop-off network of today 9,000 places around the country where you can drop off, connected to 3 regional return hubs that allow us to get the items back from the shoppers to the merchants in a really cost-effective manner. So software and logistics working together in a model which is B to B to C, meaning we sell software and logistics to merchants, but we deliver the service to their customers, to shoppers, in a B2C format.
So it's really interesting when you think about the founding of the company. Where did that idea kind of come from? I mean, how did the genesis of the idea of like, hey, this is a pain point, was what obviously you had a lot of experience in the e-commerce space in general. Can you talk a little bit about where that idea came from?
Yeah. So about 11 years ago, I was working at a flash sale retailer based in LA called Hotlook. I don't know if you guys are old enough to remember flash sale, but it was like a very popular format in e-commerce a decade ago. Out here on the East Coast, there was a company called Rue La La. There was a company called Gilt Group in New York. We were the West Coast version of that. And Hotlook, if you know the Hotlook story, ended up getting acquired by Nordstrom. And so Nordstrom had sort of Nordstrom stores, Nordstrom.com, which was their full-line business, Nordstrom Rack stores, but they didn't have any online off-price. And so we became the nucleus of what today is NordstromRack.com, which ended up becoming a multi-billion-dollar division of Nordstrom. And one of the projects that we worked on after we were acquired by Nordstrom was letting Hotlook shoppers buy online, because we were a pure play e-commerce business, and return goods to Nordstrom Rack stores. And so the insights that we gained kind of building this program, which today is called the Return to Rack program, are what led to founding the company. And in really simple terms, it was, if you give online shoppers the choice, return by mail or return in person, they overwhelmingly prefer to return in person to eliminate the hassle and weight of returns by mail, right? Don't make me print a shipping label. Don't make me find a box. Please don't make me tape it up. We joke that tape is a 4-letter word. And most importantly, like, don't make me wait to get my money back, right? And so we could eliminate shopper friction by replicating the model. On the other side, Nordstrom Rack loved the program because we started driving millions of people into their store, right? People that otherwise would have been going to the post office. And so my partner, Mark, I was leading the marketing team. My partner, Mark, was leading the mobile development team. And we thought, well, gosh, can we replicate this case study for all the other Hotlooks out there, meaning the digitally native direct-to-consumer brands that don't have a parent company like Nordstrom? So we went out in the fall of 2015 to raise money. Very different times. You could raise money with like a PowerPoint deck, which is what we did. It was like, hey, we're the guys that built the Return to Rack program. We know more about this return problem than anyone else in the world. And what we want to do is we want to enable buy online, return to store for retailers without stores. And so kind of, historical timeline, that was fall 2015. We did the first box-free in-person return to a third-party network in April of 2016. And that was a full 18 months before the Amazon-Kohl's partnership was announced, which in many ways was kind of like the breakthrough moment in returns. And it was great for us because for 18 months we had basically been getting laughed out of the room by all these retailers that were like, wait, someone's going to buy it from my website and then return it somewhere else? Like, that's crazy. That'll never work. And then Amazon-Kohl's was announced, and it was kind of like, look, the smartest people in retail in Seattle are essentially copying our business. Like, isn't this great, right? And that was really the moment that I think people, Amazon came to the same conclusions we did, which is, gosh, there's a better way to do this, better for shoppers, that drives traffic into stores. But there's also all of the logistics and supply chain opportunities when you get the first mile free, right? And in logistics, it's, most people talk about last mile, which is really in forward logistics, the cost of getting it to someone's house. In returns, which is reverse logistics, it's the cost of the first mile. And so if you give people the opportunity, a better experience to bring the item in, you'll get the first mile free, which is really the insight that led to the operational synergies.
So you've got basically partners that are the actual e-commerce retailers, and then you have this partner ecosystem that are the customers, right? And then you have this partner ecosystem where are the return locations. Can you talk about like the challenges of managing those two groups and are they independent? Are they really linked? And how do you think about balancing the two sides of that?
Yeah, great question. So the people who pay us are merchants, right? So these are companies like Everlane or Gymshark or Revolve or Levi's or Steve Madden. The companies that we work with on the other side are also merchants, but to kind of keep it simple, we talk them as like retail partners and location partners, right? So the other side, what you're asking about, are the location partners. So these are companies like Ulta Beauty or Staples. We just had a big announcement yesterday that we're expanding nationwide with GameStop. We work with Giant Eagle, which if any of you are from the Midwest, it's a regional grocer in Pennsylvania and Ohio. We work with Simon Malls. But on that side of the equation, it's really an exchange of value around foot traffic, right? So they provide the physical space, they provide the employees, we provide everything they need to join our network and to become a return bar, which means a place that people can bring items. Why would they do this? Well, they do this because it's thousands of visits a day of people that are showing up at their stores to access the service that are having this happy experience while they're there, right? So I came in to return my sweater. I just got $100 back on my credit card. I get an email receipt from Happy Returns that memorializes the transaction, and usually you'll find a coupon there in the email receipt that is encouraging you to then shop in the store, right? So imagine you're Ulta, and we can drive Revolve shoppers into Ulta Beauty and give them a coupon standing there in the store.
With fresh cash in their pocket.
Right, it's it's kind of like walking through the casino to get to the cash machine. That's kind of the same theory, right? And so for the location partners, it's really about the foot traffic that we drive to them, and I think a recognition that as e-commerce just becomes more and more prevalent, they're really being disintermediated, right? And fewer people are shopping at stores, and so a service that creates more utility in their physical stores with the same assets, right? They're not hiring new people. They don't need to give us a ton of shelf space. It's really just a new service that creates more utility in the store visit. Forward-thinking retailers are saying, yeah, this is a great way for me to kind of access all the internet shoppers that are, that I'm being disintermediated from today.
Yeah. One question this brings up is, you sort of went live about 7 or so years ago, and now we're back in kind of a more normal physical timeline. The pandemic, how did that impact your business? Because on the one hand, e-commerce exploded, but on the other hand, people were very leery to go in person for a while, at least at the beginning of the pandemic. How did that impact your business?
Yeah, it was, there were some very trying times, right?
Yeah.
So literally in a 2-week period, we went, at that point we had about 900 locations that were open. And literally in a 2-week period, we ended up going from 900 to 0 locations open, right? And our entire service, which was built on in-person interactions, was over. Yeah. It was literally like, there is no business. And so we had several months during the first part of the pandemic where there was no volume flowing through. And we were faced with, at what point do we start laying people off? At what point do we start conserving cash? At what point do we start, changing? But I think, we had this belief that, the rise of e-commerce is going to be positive for us. It's right. It's going to unlock massive growth when people come back to do things in person. And it really put a focus on trying to find location partners that were considered essential services, which is really what led to our partnership with FedEx Office. So, I talked about Ulta and Staples, but the big kind of unlock for us was that we convinced FedEx Office to join the Return Bar network during the pandemic. And because FedEx is a shipping service, that was considered something that was essential, which meant that even during COVID, FedEx offices stayed open. Yeah. And so in December 2020, we announced that FedEx Office was joining the network, and we went from 900 to 2,900 locations overnight. And it was kind of a massive validation to have one of the big carriers, that gets paid on each box saying, we're going to try to embrace this new method of returning, which aggregates items, meaning we're going to get paid on fewer, but we're going to do it because of the utility and because of the foot traffic that it offers. And so that was really kind of the breakthrough moment where it was, now we have a network which is kind of COVID-proof. Yeah. In the 2,000 FedEx Office locations.
And the benefits of the growth of e-commerce throughout the pandemic, I'm sure now pay off in the long run. Think about the longer term return.
Yeah. And that was a great and fun time because that holiday, you may remember, everyone had been at home for 9 months, and as a result, wasn't spending money on going out and wasn't spending money. And so it was kind of a great holiday season for e-commerce, probably like the breakthrough holiday season for e-commerce, which we're about 2 weeks after that, right? Whenever there's a big peak in spending, there's 2 weeks later, there's a peak in returns. And so it was like, the timing was great. And it was, okay, things aren't going to get much better than this. Like, let's go out and raise some money. And so that was kind of the plan going into 21 was like, let's go out when our numbers, literally if you were looking at the graph, it was like up, 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 and then this like massive spike back.
The deep V that,
Yeah, that represented COVID, and then all of a sudden up at a slope which was far faster than it had been for the first 5 years of the business.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about how these returns work, and you've alluded to the fact that this is at the core, right, a software that enables this to happen. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like from a software perspective, not in a deeply technical necessarily manner, but sort of how do you enable this? How do you integrate with these companies on both sides of that space?
Yeah. Well, the good news is I'm not deeply technical, so even if you wanted that, I couldn't provide it. But
it's about strategy, right? Like digital strategies.
That's right. So kind of at the core, our thesis is that it's software and logistics working together that unlocks value, right? And I think that there are many companies that provide great software. There are many companies that provide like highly scaled logistics, but very few companies do both those things well. So for us, what that translates to is, think about sort of 3 domains of software. There's software that powers the return portal on merchant websites. So, I bought the sweater on Everlane. I want to return it. Where do I go? I go to the Everlane website to get started, right? And so you'll click a link typically in the footer of an e-commerce website. That'll open a portal, branded Everlane, but powered by Happy Returns, right? So that's our software that's powering the portal experience. Shoppers kind of authenticate typically using order ID and zip code, pulls up their order history, Our software is applying the return policies. Can this item be returned? What are the return methods? Are there fees associated with the return? And then importantly, really trying to generate exchanges. If we can get a shopper to exchange rather than refund, it's better for the merchant. But refund or exchange, the item still has to get back. And so there we offer choice, right? If the merchant has stores, we'll promote the stores. Happy returns is obviously the preferred option. And then if people still want to mail, they can print a label. Very few do these days. And what we provide there is a QR code and directions to the nearest 3 drop-off points based on the zip code where the order was shipped, right? So sort of software on the front end, customer experience. Shopper then takes that QR code and brings their item without a box into any one of the 9,000 drop-off points. It's our software that's being used inside of those stores to complete the return transaction. So scan the QR code, pops up what to expect, basically connecting the work the shopper did online with the physical drop-off. Provides a workflow for the store associate to check the items in. And this is really important because that's the point that the refund or the exchange is triggered. And so, picture a visual that says, David's here, he's returning the sweater and the shirt. The store associate has to check that those 2 items are present, not what quality they're in, but just that they're there. And then when they check the items in, that's what signals the refund or signals the exchange with the merchant, meaning that we're connected to the back end of that merchant. And that can take many forms. If it's an e-commerce platform like a Shopify, it's fairly easy, or a Magento or a BigCommerce. If it's a homegrown tech stack, then we actually have to do the work to integrate directly with typically the orders table, as well as the transaction engine to be able to issue a refund, right? So it's software, that's sort of the second part of the software is the software that runs in all of the stores. And this also can take many forms. So we can integrate directly into the point of sale. If the store has tablets, there's an iPad app, there's an Android app that can sit right there. But the whole idea is that it has to be really, really easy because these are not our employees, but they're the ones that are actually offering our service. And the company's named Happy Returns, so it has to be pretty seamless. And so it's really important that that software works well. And then the third domain is in our return hubs. So picture 3 regional warehouses that support the 9,000 drop-off points. Our software powers that whole interaction of what's happening in the hubs. And the kind of supply chain or logistics piece of what we do that's interesting really comes in a simple idea, which is just aggregation. So we aggregate items across the brands from the drop-off points to the hubs. So picture like a big reusable tote that fills up during the course of the day. Might be 20 different shoppers coming in from 20 different, with returns from 20 different brands. All those items are going to be bagged and put into the tote together and shipped together. Why? Because it's far, far cheaper to ship a 20-pound box than it is to ship 21-pound boxes, right? That tote gets sent to a regional return hub. At the return hub, we're opening the tote, scanning the items, sorting by merchant, and then kind of a funny term, but re-aggregating, meaning we're taking now all of Everlane's returns from the entire East Coast and shipping it using freight shipping back to Everlane's warehouse, right? And so by aggregating across a region and aggregating across, say, a week's worth of inventory, we're able to move from parcel shipping to freight shipping, which is just a step change function in cost, right? So picture, a full truckload of returns coming back on pallets, far, far more cost effective on a cost per unit basis than each of those individual boxes going from the shopper. So again, kind of using aggregation to do that. But it's our software that powers that whole flow through the warehouse because we have to make sure that we're tracking each one of those items and that we can communicate to our merchant's warehouse, hey, the truckload has left the building. It arrives on Tuesday and it's going to have 8 pallets with 500 items a pallet. And here's all of the data so that you can receive against it, right? Yeah. So it's important that we provide the software for the entire journey, which is a fairly large surface area to tackle in terms of what we need to be good at.
You've mentioned a number of clothing retailers, which obviously I know is where you kind of came from. What does the diversity of products look like that you're managing? Because I would imagine clothes easier to aggregate, right, than some of the things that we can buy online today. Are there limits for you, or are there companies like we would never work with this kind of business because the logistics are just a difficult?
Yeah, so we would never work with furniture,
Right.
right? Most, everything that we do could be considered sort of a soft good or a small consumer electronics device. But the majority of the business is in kind of fashion, apparel, footwear. And why? Well, these are categories that are highly penetrated online that have just massive return rates, right? And the idea of the way people shop for clothing or footwear tends to be, the industry term is bracketing, but it's this idea of, if I've never bought shoes from this brand before, so what do? I buy multiple sizes, I try them on at home, I pick the one that fits best and I send the others back, right? And so in the categories we work in, the soft goods side, especially where there's sizing, there just tend to be a lot of e-commerce orders that have returns sort of built into them. And so, highly penetrated, high return rates, kind of, endemic return challenges, that's really good for us. But, back to your question, we do lots of consumer electronics, peripherals, phone cases and small, we do things like toys, a lot of baby products. So it is a range, home goods, the soft goods side of home, so things like towels and sheets and even small kind of kitchen appliance type stuff. But there's a practical limit. So the tote itself looks kind of like a big soft beer cooler that you would take to the beach in the summer, and so it has to fit in the tote, and that's kind of the practical limit.
Makes sense. Yeah, it makes sense. So fast forward. You mentioned this, but being acquired by PayPal, but you also mentioned working with companies like Shopify and things. Can you talk about that relationship with PayPal and how that's impacted kind of your business in a since that acquisition, or if it has at all, as well as kind of the way that you approach partners? Because Shopify is kind of a little bit different than, let's say, working with Everlane, where it's a direct to consumer. They're kind of enabling that from other small vendors and then aggregating. Not to push you in too much off the record territory, but can you talk a little bit about that kind of positioning and sort of how you kind of serve these different kinds of partners?
Yeah. So pre-acquisition, we probably had a closer relationship with Shopify, just because it's sort of a platform that was enabling a lot of D2C brands and made it really easy to kind of get into the categories that we work in. Post-transaction, there's obviously a fair amount of overlap between Shopify and PayPal, but believe it or not, the two companies really view themselves as more, kind of, I guess the analogy would be, if Amazon is sort of like the evil empire, these are the guys that are arming the Jedis, and I do think they view themselves as complementary from that point of view, right? Sure. And so if Shopify,
piece of the ecosystem.
Yeah. And so if Shopify is the commerce platform that you opt to use, PayPal actually comes automatically installed. That's just kind of part of it. You have to opt out of having PayPal, and so the companies have a financially vested interest in working together. Now, we don't fit squarely into PayPal's sort of payments business. We're sort of, a little bit outside of that in the sort of broader vision of what PayPal can be. And so I think that gives us a little bit of flexibility to kind of, work with both parties in a positive manner. But there certainly are some areas where there's overlap. And so we have to be sensitive to the kinds of things that we can do with third parties that, kind of like, you got to make sure that your parent company isn't interested in doing it before you can go out and strike a partnership with somebody else. And there should be no surprises, right? And that's kind of, just part of being a good corporate citizen is making sure there are no surprises.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. When you think about returns, there's still a big divide in many retailers whether or not returns are free or there's a charge associated to that. Does a service like this allow brands to be better at offering free returns? Is that part of the pitch? Is that part of the kind of value proposition, or is it really separate?
Yeah. So there was a ton in the press this year about, is this the year that's the end of free returns, right? Is this like, have we finally reached the tipping point? And our response to that is free isn't getting any less popular, right? And we do a lot of consumer research, and we talk to people about returns. And what we have found from the beginning is that shoppers are just allergic to paying fees for returns. to the point that they will not shop a place that charges for them, right? And I think especially in the categories that we work in, it's like, look, I can't try it on. I don't know how it's going to fit. You know, if you want me to take the risk of shopping with you, then you need to give me a free option. But no one said the free option has to be the mail, right? And a big part of our value prop for the merchants is that we're cheaper than the mail. Why are we cheaper? You know, because of the aggregation that we talked about. And so, you know, when I talk to merchants and when I talk to the press, what I say is like, you know, free returns are still the single most important attribute that shoppers want. They just want there to be some free option. And so what really forward-thinking retailers are doing is not saying, you know, oh, I didn't used to charge for returns, now I'm going to charge for them. It's actually having nuance to their policy, right? It's like, you know, if you want to return with happy returns, that's the free option, right? There are 9,000 places, and you know, 9 out of 10 US households are within a 10-mile radius of a happy returns drop-off point. So like, and that's cheaper for me, right? And so, you know, free is really just who's subsidizing it. Is the shopper subsidizing it, or is the merchant subsidizing it? You know, so a free return for a merchant means they're paying for it. And so what smart merchants are doing is saying, well, if I have to pay for it, you know, if free is important to you as a consumer, and I have to pay for it, I'm going to pay for the cheaper option for me, and then I'm going to put fees on the thing which is expensive for me, which is the mail, right? And it is impossible to get economies of scale, you know, shipping individual items back, right? Like, and it has gotten far, far more expensive to ship things. You know, like shipping a pair of shoes across the country, you know, $9, $10. And so, you know, by putting fees on the mail, what they're basically saying is, you know, that is a disincentive to use this thing where I have no ability to get economies of scale. That's good for us, right? Obviously, like when there are fees on one and they're not on the other, you know, it drives more people to happy returns. You know, and to kind of take that, you know, one step further, you know, we do work with a number of retailers that have their own stores. And so like Steve Madden is a great example. There are probably like 75, 80 Steve Maddens around the country. They make it free to return to Steve Madden stores. They put a small fee on happy returns. I think it's like $2 for return. And then it's like, you know, $9 or $10 to use the mail, right? And so what are they doing? Well, they're using their fees intelligently to try to drive behavior, right? Because the best return for them is if somebody walks into a Steve Madden store, then they have the best chance of trying to, you know, ensure that the person, you know, walks out with something. You know, if they walked into a return, the store associate's highly motivated to make sure they walk out with something else.
Yeah. So switching gears just a little, you know, you are a Dartmouth alum and a Tuck alum. You know, can you talk a little bit about your decision or what your experience was like coming at Tuck and why Tuck was important for you?
Well, I got in. That was for starters. And Tuck let me defer. That was also really important. I had been working at an e-commerce, so I'm really going to date myself here, but so this was like the late 90s, and I was working for a company called Free Markets that had gone public kind of December 1999. Really good times. You know, that was like a great Christmas party. And you know, the company was worth $10 billion or something, and you know, we're like sitting around the bar talking about buying a sports team. You know, it was like really good times, right? You know, fast forward 6 months when the lockup expired and, you know, the stock had come down, you know, 95%. Very, very different conversations, right? But, you know, I had gotten in, I had applied to 3 schools, I'd gotten into 2. When it was time to make the decision to go, you know, our COO came to me and said, hey, you know, you've been part of this chapter of seeing the growth of free markets, but I really think for your career, if you stick around another year, you know, you'll watch us go through the hard part of getting profitable. Yeah. And I think if you leave now, like, you won't see the complete story. And so that was, you know, reason to defer for a year. So I tried to defer to 2 schools. Only one would let me defer, and that was Tuck. So that made it really easy, right? Yeah. And there was a woman that I was dating at the time who had actually come to my admitted students weekend at Tuck and was like, wow, business school looks like a really good time. Like, I want to go to business school. And so, you know, deferring had the added benefit of letting her apply as well. And so she got into Tuck, and so then it was kind of a no-brainer to come here. Yeah, it was, you know, awesome to be here as an undergrad. I had no idea, like, what was going on down here on this end of campus. Yeah. And, you know, then you come to Tuck, and you're like, oh my gosh, like they're having a good time there too, right? And yeah, but it was a really, really fun 2 years. I love this part of the country, and it was neat to be back here as an adult, to be able to like, go out to all the restaurants that you could only go to when your parents were visiting, as an undergrad, and be able to like, I don't know if people still do like ski houses at Killington, but that was a big part of my time here as a Tuck student. It's just like neat to be back in this part of the country in a different part of your life, when you kind of had the resources to really explore it.
Postdoc, you went to eBay, right? And we're doing eBay Motors. Yeah. eBay being one of the more transformative kind of e-commerce companies, who then also, acquired PayPal before you got there. Can you is that a coincidence, or that you're now working with PayPal again, or do those relationships, was that part of the kind of connection to PayPal as well?
So more coincidence, okay. But I will say, like, for anyone that's worked in Silicon Valley, like it's very kind of insider, and it's funny, like the way I did my intern search between years, at Tuck was literally just like started with a blank. None of the companies I was interested in were coming to campus to recruit, right. So I literally just like took a blank sheet of paper and wrote a list of the companies that I admired. And then I went through the database and just said, where is there a Tuck grad at one of these companies? And there was a Tuck grad at eBay, and so that quickly became the top of the list, and I just badgered him until I got an internship there, basically. Yeah. And then went back. And what's cool is that I wasn't at eBay that long, probably 2 years in total, but so many of the people that I met and the relationships that I formed there have influenced my time. If you just look at like Happy Returns, like multiple angel investors were people that I met at eBay. The VC who led our seed round and led our Series A was somebody that I worked with at eBay. A guy that we brought in to be our interim CMO during one period of the company was a guy that I worked with at eBay. And then, of course, all of those data points provide credibility, when a company like PayPal comes calling, because it's like, oh, we can reference check this company very easily through all these connections. And that definitely happens. And it's like, it's a brand that, oh, this is somebody that worked at a company that we know really well and we admire, and it definitely creates credibility.
That's great. And I'm going to come to the audience in about a minute. You've been on this entrepreneurial journey. What have you learned about entrepreneurship, in founding the company that you'd want, you wish you knew at the beginning that you know now, or that you wish you knew when you were a student here 20 years ago?
Well, I mean, going back to kind of the eBay point, your network is so important, and I don't think I appreciated that, especially, whatever field you work in. Like careers are long, like they're really long, and you're going to run into the same people again and again and again. And so it really pays to be a good human, right? And to not burn bridges and to like leave places, better than you found them, right? Because again, you're going to, the person that, was a peer might end up, being someone that you're selling to later, or someone that worked for you might end up being in a position of decision-making authority later in your career, right? And it's like the balance of power, like that people in one environment will change. The other piece is like you're surrounded by all these interesting, great classmates that are going to go on to do amazing and fun things. Like you gotta cherish that and cultivate those relationships, and it's hard because you'll go start a family and you'll be busy and and it's hard to make time to do that. But it's like those are some of the best relationships, and what's cool is we're now moving into this other phase of our careers. I'm an investor in a private equity fund that one of my classmates at Tuck founded. And there's another guy that was on my freshman trip, good friend of mine who runs a real estate fund, and I'm a small investor in his real estate fund. And it's like, it's not just about people in your industry, but it's about the opportunity set that like all of your classmates will bring to you. So definitely spend time kind of cultivating your network. The other piece, which is, it's nice to be here and to be able to talk about success, but the reality is, even though we are successful, like there are a million failures along the way, and that is definitely not something that they teach you at Tuck, right? Like you get here because you've been successful, and you are around a bunch of people that are successful, and you're brainwashed here to expect to be successful, and that's really powerful, right? It's really great, but along the way, like there are going to be failures. You're going to get fired, right? You're going to take a big job and it's not going to work out. You're going to be part of a new business idea at some company that will be a miserable flop, right? And it's really, especially in entrepreneurship, to get to success, you go through this cycle of failing again and again and again. And there's like a level of resilience and sort of grit that is required that I don't think I in any way appreciated until I went through it.
Yeah. All right. Well, that was a good place to kind of turn over to our students. What questions from the audience? Carson.
I'm curious about your transition from a marketing leader to a CEO. How did being like a CMO and a marketing leader throughout much of your career prepare you well to step into the CEO role? And also, like, what challenges or blind spots did you face when you made that transition? And that as a founder /
Yeah. Well, I'll start by saying I don't think I was a particularly good CMO, even though I had the title in a couple places. It is a hard job. I mean, it's a really, really hard job because it sort of requires both like right and left side of your brain, the sort of branding and emotional connection side, as well as just like marketing has become like hardcore math. And so you kind of need to have both of those. It's kind of humbling to have that job. I think if anything, like that's very useful as a CEO because like a big part of being the founder or the co-founder or the CEO is like understanding what you're not good at and trying to build a team around you of things that you are not good at. And so like going through being a CMO and like seeing how hard that was and seeing all the different sort of disciplines that you need to excel at to be a great CMO was useful because it was like, hey, I'm not good at a lot of this stuff, right? I need to find people who are good at a lot of this stuff. What was the second part of your question?
I guess, yeah, like challenges and also how being a CMO prepared you for other challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so the piece of being a CMO that I think I was really good at was sort of the biz dev side of things. Like, yes, the math part was great. I'd say I was decent at the branding side of it. But a lot of interesting marketing comes from like partnerships and exchanges of value, and like at the core, like BD or business development is really about trying to understand like what is the value going to be for each of the parties in this transaction, and how do I like extract from my partner what's important to make sure that we can deliver that, right? So kind of like going back to where our conversation started. We talk about making returns beautiful. So what does that mean? Well, it means something different for shoppers than for merchants than for the planet, right? What do shoppers want? They want friction-free returns. What do merchants want? They want the lowest possible cost. What does the planet want? It wants sustainability. And so I think it's that like mindset around understanding this exchange of value has to be kind of core to everyone for a business to really succeed. I think that's probably the biggest lesson from the marketing side that I applied to Happy Returns.
I guess on the flip side to Carson's question, what's the transition been like from being a CEO and co-founder to now be a much larger company?
Not without its challenges. So, I think the biggest change is probably like the pace. And, as a startup, I'm sure you've read like, Mark Zuckerberg, fail fast or move fast and break things, or right, like that really is kind of the mindset. It's like you'd rather try something and have it not work and know that that's the wrong path so that you can get to the right path. In a big company, especially a big company that's highly regulated, like one that handles your money, right, that handles like billions of dollars a day in transactions, that's built its brand on sort of safety, they move at a very different pace, right? And so, you kind of take what you used to be able to accomplish in a planning cycle, call it a year, as a startup, you got to kind of cut that back quite a bit because everything new that you want to do is going to have multiple layers of approval, right? And it's not just like one approval. If 10 people need to approve it, you got to get 10 out of 10. Right? Because if one of the 10 says no, then the answer is no. And so it's just sort of like figuring out how to pace the organization, how to set planning and budgeting. In a startup, you're like, okay, what do we do this month? Okay, what do we need next month? Next quarter? Like, much different in a big organization, right? They want to make sure that you are signing up for numbers, that you're going to hit your numbers consistently. Like that's how you build credibility. And so I think it's just like reorienting yourself to a different, it's just sort of process, right? And it's just things that and that's the bad side, right? The good side is, you submit a budget at PayPal and people say like, I don't think you're thinking big enough, right? This plan calls for thousands of merchants. Like, we work with 19 million merchants. Like, how do you get to tens of thousands, next year, not 1,000, right? And so there's like the ability to think and dream bigger, the ability to invest with a much longer time horizon, the ability to sort of build for scale and expect scale, that is just, so awesome and never a luxury that you were allowed as a startup.
You mentioned briefly sustainability there, and obviously there's a ton of waste in the return pipeline, just in general, mostly on the merchant side, not so much with shipping. You guys are eliminating some of the emissions just by aggregating the shipments. Do you see a role for the platform software in shortening the chain to the end consumer or reducing waste at the merchant level, or really like anywhere in there when it comes to those returns being serviceable, not serviceable, et cetera?
Yeah. So I'm going to answer that in sort of two parts. So the sustainability side of what we do comes in really sort of two forms. Aggregation reduces literally the physical space required on a truck. So just like more, fewer shipments because we're aggregating. And then everything we ship is in reusable containers. So we're sort of eliminating cardboard from the equation. And, probably 8 years ago, like China stopped buying our recycled cardboard. And so now most of that just goes straight to the landfill. So it actually is we can say with a straight face that happy returns are better for the planet. Your question, I think, is more around like, where does this stuff go, right? And for a long time, like if you'd been, in the room and seen the whiteboard, like for a long time, we conceived of the business as saying like, hey, if you just look at like the contribution margin on a $40 T-shirt, right? Like there isn't enough value there to really justify, getting it back, putting it back on the shelf. God forbid you sell it again. Now you got to pay to fill the order, right? And then if somebody calls customer service, that's another couple dollars. So you're probably going to be upside down in that T-shirt. And so for a long time we talked about this idea of the next best place to sell the return might not be the place that it came from. Stay tuned. Right, I think there's a lot to be done there. I think that there are really, really encouraging building blocks right now with all the re-commerce businesses, companies like ThreadUp and The RealReal, Poshmark, which I think most of you probably know is started by a Tuck grad. All companies that are tackling the same idea that the next best place and the next person to own this might not necessarily, the path might not be back through where it came from. If you think about what we've built at the highest level, it's just like a very it's just like a better mousetrap for getting items from shoppers to some place. Could you apply that to other models? Like absolutely you could, right? You just sort of need the intelligence layer around, okay, what is the math equation telling you is the next best place to sell it? And then you need the value-added services to say, is this item in a condition that it can be resold? So stay tuned.
Interesting. Tracy's son, the co-founder, will be the graduation speaker.
I just saw that. Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, that's awesome.
When building a team for starting a new company or within large organizations, what advice do you have in terms of finding the right technical talent? Right. So I imagine that you might have had technical co-founders, or in PayPal, you also had to hire people who bring the tech expertise. What's your advice in finding the right technical partner?
Yeah. So my partner Mark is the sort of technical co-founder of Happy Returns. So I'm going to share what I think he has learned more so than me. We have a very rigorous hiring process that starts with a coding test. So literally, no one even looks at your resume until you pass a coding test. And our engineers put a lot of time and a lot of thought into that test. And so as a way to take a lot of applicants and screen them quickly, that is really the method. That same idea of cases or exercises is actually something that we use in all the disciplines. And oftentimes we'll literally take real data from a problem that we're trying to solve, anonymize it, hand it to the applicant and say, hey, before we start to like you too much, right? Before we go into your background and all that, like, can you plan to just do this short exercise to make sure that you can kind of qualify to work here? Once you've sort of jumped over that hurdle, then you can focus on more of the soft things, right? Is this somebody that that we want on the team? And the way I kind of always describe it is like talented people always have options, always, right? So it's really a function, when I'm interviewing someone, by the time they get to me, it's usually, they've jumped over the competence bar, our team likes them. I'm always interested in what do you want out of this next phase of your career? Because if it's not a match, and if we can't offer you what you want, then it's probably not the right place, no matter how competent you are, right? And a lot of that is, it could be a lot of different things, right? It could be, hey, I want to manage people. Or, it's really important to me that I have this kind of work-life balance. Or, gosh, I want to live in this, whatever it is. I just want to be really honest with people about whether or not we can provide that. Because if you can't, if it's not a good match, it's never going to work.
Hi David, my name is Gagan, and I'm really intrigued by the whole reverse logistics business. My question is how do you think of competitiveness of happy returns as a business? So for example, I'm thinking your customers are mainly retail merchants. I'm guessing they would be very happy to get to another reverse logistic operator who is giving them at a lower price because that's their main, they're price sensitive. So what is the competitive advantage, and if PayPal helps you build that competitive advantage when you get it?
Yeah. So for the first probably 6-7 years of the business, we were really competing against the mail, right? The good news, the secret is that the mail sucks, so it's pretty easy, right? It would be like starting a business to compete with the DMV, and so, but changing consumer behavior is really, really hard, right? It's really, really hard. So, at the beginning, it was about, we were so focused on delivering on the brand promise of naming the company Happy Returns, and if you were to come to a team meeting, we live and breathe Net Promoter Score, which is customer satisfaction. And so if you were to come to a team meeting, which we have every week, every week we read positive Net Promoter Score comments and we read the negative Net Promoter Score comments. Why? Because we want our team to understand that at the end of the day, it's real people that are experiencing our service. That is also key to our long-term sort of competitive advantage in the market, because when we deliver on the brand promise and when people have a good experience, they become very, very loyal, right? And we've had retailers who I won't name, who have tried to take Happy Returns away, right? They were unhappy with the cost or whatever, and they tried to take this service away and make their customers go back to the mail, and it basically had a mutiny because people are wait, I used to be able to walk down the street and return it with a QR code, and now I have to go back to printing a label and boxing it and checking my credit card statement for the next 2 to 3 weeks to get, no way, right? And so it's been a long challenge to kind of beat the mail. I think we finally have accomplished that and finally have gotten to the scale where we've essentially rest in peace mail, you're never really coming back. But you have to continue to deliver on delighting shoppers if you want to have any kind of pricing power, right? PayPal has absolutely helped, right? I mean, nothing legitimizes you like getting acquired by a $100 billion market cap company, especially one with the history of PayPal. And I think that for us, that for a long time there was this sort of I know what Happy Returns is. It seems intriguing, but I don't, as a retailer, I'm not sure that I want to do that or want to invest in that yet. Then you get acquired by PayPal, and people are like, all right, it's not a question of if, am I going to work with Happy Returns? It's a question of when am I going to work with Happy Returns, right? Because it's getting acquired by PayPal means you're going to be part of the landscape. You're not going anywhere. You're stable, and I think that that really is important when people are trusting you with their end consumer relationships and that end consumer experience, is knowing that there's a brand like PayPal behind it.
Thank you. So did those customers come back with who left you?
Yeah, they did. Yeah.
Hi David, I am a big proponent of happy returns, and I would say one of the biggest reasons I started shopping at Amazon was because it wasn't there for a happy return. So I'm just curious about your strategy or what the practices you look for when doing your location partnerships. Because sometimes I feel like Ulta, Staples, those are very different companies. So I'm just wondering, how do you select your partners?
Yeah, great question. So at the beginning, it was whoever would work with us. But to kind of give you the brief history, so we started with the malls. Why did we start with the malls? Because like 8 years ago when we were founding the company, the malls were just getting decimated by the internet, right? And it was like no longer, it was like mall apocalypse was like the headline, and it was, this mall's closing, so no one's going there anymore. And it was like who will work with us? Who's desperate for the foot traffic, right? It's the mall. And the mall, again, this is like pre-Amazon Kohl's. Like, when you were going to pitch Everlane, who was one of our first customers, like, they would have been like, wait, buy on Everlane, return to a makeup store? That doesn't make any sense, right? But buy on Everlane, return to the mall? Okay, like I kind of get that. Like there's enough of a connection. We sell apparel. There's apparel sold in the mall. None of the D2C guys were really threatened by the mall at this time. In fact, a few of them were already starting to like experiment with stores in the mall. And so it was kind of, like who needs your service, right? Kind of fast forward to today, the way we think about it is, we want the category leader in each of like the main areas where there are big store networks left. So Ulta is the category leader in beauty, right? You kind of have, Ulta, Sephora. Staples is the category leader in office supply. Simon is the category leader in malls, right? We have a couple, GameStop is kind of the last man standing in gaming, if you will. Giant Eagle isn't necessarily a leader in grocery, but they're certainly a leader in their region, and they're known as being a grocer that experiments with things and is quick to kind of, they're like the early adopter in your curve, so it's important for us to kind of work with them. There are more partnerships that are coming that are other kind of category leaders, things like consumer electronics and pet supplies. But really what you're looking for is big store networks that have great shopper experiences that are leaders in their category. Because when you work with someone like Ulta, it creates a halo effect on happy returns. Like we're much more legit when we have a partnership with someone like that. And so it's really the category leaders who understand the consumer experience.
When you think about your customers, how difficult is it to, you always have to customize the prices for them, and as you think about the challenges of growing and sort of continuing your market penetration, what are some of the current challenges that you still face from retailers that are hesitant to join? Is it, especially, are they still there given that PayPal is a big part of the company now?
Yeah, so the way our pricing works is we charge per item that's returned. There's no fee for the software. It's just transaction fees. And that was a big change after we were acquired. Why? Because PayPal monetizes on a per transaction basis, right? There's no cost to just have PayPal as a checkout option. It's only when shoppers select PayPal that they get paid. And so we wanted to kind of align our monetization with the way that they charge. If you kind of peel that back, what you would find is a rate table. And the rate table is based on sort of two, on one axis is the volume of the retailer, right? The more that they ship, the cheaper it gets. And then the other axis is the size of the goods. So things sort of like small, medium, large, extra large. So small would be like a swimsuit. Medium would be like like a shirt. Large would be a pair of shoes. Extra large would be like a comforter, right? Something that's big and bulky. Why? Because that is exactly the way kind of dim weight shipping works, and our single biggest cost is shipping, right? Even though we aggregate, like it's still, the bulk of our variable cost is in the shipping side of things. So the question that we face, and I would say like the biggest challenge to answer your question is really like, cost savings has always been a part of our value proposition, but now that we are getting as large as we are, and now that we have we've sort of effectively changed consumer behavior, like how much of a discount do you actually have to give to the mail, right? And how compelling does the savings have to be? Because ultimately, like today, for the merchants we work with, on average, 75% of their returns come back through Happy Returns. 25% are still the mail. Like, how much of that do you have to capture before you can be at parity with the mail, right? Because just kind of think about like macro, or I guess it would be more micro, right? There's like surplus that we're giving up, to price to be able to make the offering compelling, to the merchants. But at a certain point, like we don't need to do that anymore. And that's the debate every year when we go to set prices is, okay, like how deep does the discount have to be, to both ensure that you can retain, your merchant customers and win new ones. Because ultimately, at some point, we'll just declare victory and we'll say, yeah, we're priced at parity with the mail. And why can we do that? Because, your consumers don't want to go back to this old experience.
Well, I think we're just out of time, but I think for me this was a wonderful opportunity to learn more about your business and about your kind of journey, and provide a lot of insights into kind of the reverse logistics space as well. Want to thank you for joining us today and helping us kind of better understand what you're doing and sort of where the space is headed. It's been truly wonderful. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.